the best practice of community engagement focus groups. We'll compile a recommendation from folks. And then we'll have consider community voices to invite in the future, just sort of like a quick summary of our day-to-day. But as folks are joining in, we'd like to do our roll call. Dominique Gomez, I believe she's going to be a couple of minutes late and on her way. Myself, subcommittee chair, Jaime Valdez. Okay, see you. Hey, Jaime.
I'm here.
Kimberly Mendoza Cook.
Hi, yes, I'm here.
Hi, Kimberly. Mara Brosi Wickshar. Sorry, my apologies for the mispronunciation.
We haven't seen her yet.
Yeah, haven't seen her either. And she'll be joining shortly. Marsha Nelson.
I'm here. I'm just eating. Jonathan, bless you.
No worries, no worries. Thank you for joining us. And then Jonathan Asher.
Hi, present. Had to get off mute. Sorry.
No worries. Thank you for joining us. So then we're going to be moving into our what's it called? Our land acknowledgement. Give me 2 seconds to pull it up. I'd like to do it. So as we do this land acknowledgement, we really do it to recognize the land. It's truly an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring Indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from immemorial time. It is important to understand the longstanding history that has brought us to reside in this land and seek an understanding in our place within history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in past tense. They're a historical context or of colonialism. It's a current and ongoing process. And we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation in it. And it's also worth noting that acknowledgement of the land, it's Indigenous protocol. So we would like to acknowledge the land we live, work, learn, and commute on. It's the original lands of many tribal nations here in the state of Colorado, Utah, Arapaho, and Cheyenne. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory. And we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people that still connect this land in which we gather. Kind of as usual, I like to put our land, if you don't know where you are in and what land you're in, feel free to look it up and feel free to tell us in the chat what land you are in right now. Perfect. Yeah, and I see there are a couple other task force members are present. Thank you so much for being here with us as well. I do want to acknowledge that we have a couple other task force members here. So now we're going to be moving sort of in our icebreaker. We are a small but mighty crew, but also feel free to add your points in the chat. And sort of one of my icebreakers that tends to, for some people might be very superficial, for some people might be deeper in how they engage with this work. But what is your first memory of water? A lot of people, their first memory of water might have been in the beach, might have been by a river, it might have been just, if you don't live in an area that's close to the water, it might have just been your, I don't know, I want to say your first bath. But, everybody has a different relationship to water. And I'll say probably my first memory of water and fruity movement was when I was a child. My mom will take me often to the beach. I grew up in Venezuela, in Caracas. It's about 45 minutes away from the beach. And for me was experiencing the ocean, being present in that space, understanding also the many ramifications of climate change as our coastal line kept moving forward due to the many hurricanes that we had in Venezuela and the coastal area. But yeah, anybody, if they want to share their first memory of water.
Hi, Hilda. This is Kimberly. I'll go. I grew up, or I was born and spent the first probably 10 years of my life in a small town in Wyoming. And it's called Green River for the reason because the Green River runs through it. And it was right behind my grandmother's house. And so for good or for bad, it was sort of fun to kind of tube, but also it was like this scary thing that the kids had to stay away from the river because of the currents. So that was my first water.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. Anybody else that would like to go?
I don't know that I have a first memory of water that really stands out, but I do love this prompt or icebreaker, and because since early childhood, I've just been fascinated by water, and I mean, I love just looking at it, drinking it. It's my favorite drink. Most of the time I'm offered anything, multiple, drinks, and my first choice is almost always water. I grew up swimming from almost the time I could walk, and even swam competitively in high school. I love swimming in it, playing in it, watching it crash and flow and shape the landscape. So much so that I used to kind of build little landscapes in my front yard, and I would build a dam and have cars and stuff in there, and then I'd turn on the hose and let the water run, and kind of break down the dam and create its own path, its own meanders down the yard, and watch those meanders kind of shift and change until my mom would come out and throw a fit because I was wasting water. But later on, I learned about people facing little or no access to safe drinking water. And I realized how privileged I was to be able to waste water and just watch it run through my makeshift hydrology models in the front yard. But that was an important lesson. It's a lesson that I carry into this work and most of my work that I love and passionate about. And I still have that same love for water. Anytime I'm around a lake or a stream or creek, I just want to get in it.
Thank you so much, Jaime. Really appreciate it. Marsha, I see your hand up.
Yeah, so my first memory of water, I grew up overseas. My father was in the military. So my first memory is riding a ship from South Korea to Japan. So riding on a big old ship, seeing the ocean. It was pretty cool. So that was my first memory of water.
Thank you, Marsha. Anybody else that would like to join in?
I'll provide mine. My first memory was actually like not a super positive one. It was in preschool, and I remember a teacher trying to teach me how to blow bubbles in like a bucket of water, and they were a little bit aggressive about it. And so for a long time, I was like a little bit afraid of water, and I'm still not the strongest swimmer in the world. But my favorite memories of water were I went on to become a raft guide for a long time here in Colorado, and just absolutely my favorite memories. And I'm still an avid kayaker and raft guide, and just love being on the river and love being in the water any chance I can. So nice to have some redemption from my early water experience.
Yeah, rafting guide. That's definitely no joke. You must love really water now. Not to be afraid of it, I guess, for sure. Anybody else? And also to our participants and attendees, feel free to add your first memories of water in the chat. We'd love to read them.
I can go. I'm Elizabeth Goder. I'm a newer member of the task force. I just wanted to introduce myself again in case I haven't introduced myself when you've been on a meeting. And I think I'm joining the subcommittee meeting. So thank you for having me and bringing me up to speed. My first memory of water, I grew up in Chicago, so I think it would be going to the beach along Lake Michigan. And similarly to Jonathan, I was a canoe guide in northern Minnesota. I now work in water policy, but I think just moving out to Colorado, which I've been here for about 10 years, and just seeing the stark difference in water scarcity and how water is managed and how different that is from the Midwest was a big eye opener for me, and why I am passionate about water today and working in it.
I'll go as well. Hi, everyone. This is Dominique Gomez. Apologies for being a few minutes late, double booked at this time. One of my first memories of water, so I grew up here, but I remember visiting family in Nebraska and coming out and the morning dew, you know, in more humid climates, that it's like the grass is just wet in the morning. And even if it hasn't rained, it's just very different from here, where we don't typically have that. Although maybe this morning, I think we had a little bit of morning dew, unusual for us. So I also have a passion for water, and you know, hiking last week down near where I grew up, south of Colorado Springs. It is drier than most Augusts that I remember. And it's rough to see how dry it is right now, but love water.
Thank you so much, Dominica. No need to apologize on timing at all. Thank you so much for joining us. If I believe all of our task force members were able to participate, also to the public again, still you're more than welcome to share via the chat. But for our next item, we wanted to review our summary notes. I know, I don't know if you can add the link, Natalie. Thank you so much. So here we have our summary of our notes from our last session, which we're able to look at. We had a couple of presenters, which was fantastic, being able to have a couple of presenters that have done deep work in focus groups and working with Black community in the Denver metro area. We had Sean Davis and Sandra Young from the NAACP. And we were able to review sort of the different parameters of best practices, such as time and notice and outreach tools. But if folks have any questions, please feel free to review the notes. And Elizabeth, if you have any questions as you're joining in the subcommittee, feel free to let us know. We're happy to set up some time apart or aside from this meeting to chat more about it. Great. So then that transitions us to our update and selection of focus group and contractors. So we're able to receive one contract proposal. You guys should have received that proposal in your email. Please let us know if you did not, but also it's being attached here to the link to the chat. So one of the pieces we wanted to make sure that individuals, if I know folks are very busy, maybe a thumbs up if folks were able to review it. If not, happy to give task force members maybe 5 minutes to review the content and for us to be able to have a conversation about it around you know, discussions on next steps. How do we feel about this proposal and the timeline for the focus groups and reporting that will be happening. So Natalie, did I miss anything?
Oh, you didn't miss anything, but maybe just a slight amendment, since at the last subcommittee meeting, everyone agreed to sort of a subcommittee to be a part of the selection committee. And so I think the folks who are part of that selection committee have had the proposal and had a chance to review it. I think in advance of this call, if you want to proceed with a conversation led by that selection committee. Which includes Kimberly, Dominique, Marcia, Ilda, and Mara.
Yeah, if you want, we can proceed immediately with the discussion. If you know, folks can also review it as we're having some of this conversation. But from the subcommittee members, if any initial thoughts or questions or initial ideas that come out from reviewing the proposal.
I just had a question, maybe Natalie, for you, and not really specific to this proposal, but given this is the only one that we have, is there are there certain parameters for the agency that we have to wait for more, or can we proceed with one if that's all we get? Kind of how does that work logistically?
Yeah, we're in a position to proceed with just one. We aren't required. This is below the sort of cutoff point for competitive bids, and so we aren't required to do that. We wanted to have, I mean, competition is good. We would have liked to have had more proposals come in, and we actually expected a few more to come in over the weekend. And I think this might just be, I think we can all really a very, very busy time with a pretty tight timeline. But I think so there's no limitation for us going forward in terms of the logistics or legal requirements. But I think, yeah, for you, Kimberly, or others who are part of that selection committee, if you wanted to sort of share what was strong about the proposal we received, or what we want to do in terms of next steps, recognizing that we're trying to launch these focus groups pretty swiftly here, so that we're able, the subcommittee on best practices for community engagement is able to take into account the findings of those focus groups as part of the recommendations the subcommittee puts together. Yeah, so Elizabeth, we put it out. We've been announcing it for almost 6 weeks on calls and doing some individual outreach. And so I think there's always more that we could have done. And I think we learned some lessons to maybe strengthen our outreach going forward. But it had been out and announced at several, both Environmental Justice Advisory Board and Action Task Force meetings and subcommittee meetings. We were sort of trying to all collectively get it out to our networks to see who might be interested in either the whole scope of work, so multiple focus groups, or maybe a particular individual focus group for a particular demographic was also a way we thought it might play out in terms of people's possible proposals coming forward.
Yeah, we had a collective proposal that was going to come in, and the consultants were really busy to be able to submit it before the deadline. So we thought that at least we'll have another competitive bidding, a competitive proposal, but we did not have another one.
I will just quickly put on my state fiscal procedures hat and note it's not technically an RFP, or for our, the folks who don't know what that acronym means, request for proposals. As a scope of work, it's something, given the low dollar value and fast timeline, that we have the flexibility to negotiate directly with a vendor that we know are capable and well equipped to provide the service. So it is a little different than that formal request for proposals process folks might be more familiar with for larger value state purchasing processes.
Thank you.
I'll just say that we did get one, but I would say that having reviewed it, I feel like this is a qualified vendor. The experience, and just even sort of the breakdown and the approach seems all fairly reasonable. So, of course, it's always nice to have choices, but I do feel like this is a vendor that seems well suited for the work. So there were no major flags in terms of, areas that they wouldn't be able to cover.
Marsha.
So yeah, I guess I'll echo Dominique as part of the subcommittee. Yeah, I'm not sure which one of those subcommittees. Yeah, I mean, for me, it would have been nice if we did receive other responses, but I will say, as someone who is in the world of RFPs and RFQs all the time, it's not unusual to see some non-response in that area, which is unfortunate. And I think a lot of it is a lot of businesses are busy right now and just don't have the time. It could be a many different things. I wish there were more, but in terms of the qualifications of the firm, I didn't see any issues there. And I think it would be a fine candidate for the work that we need done right now. So just my 2 cents.
Yeah, and I think something that I would like to elevate as well as the subcommittees that we'll be checking in constantly. And I think that's something that we want to make sure sort of we'll have different benchmarks and different check-ins with them. I think because it is such a short proposal or contract, we'll be probably having meetings with them on a weekly basis and guiding conversations as you know what we would like to expect as this is being delivered and executed in the ground.
Yeah, I didn't have any issues. I think I'd like to get started on the process. And so, you know, given that this is a vendor that is qualified to do the work and we can get started sooner rather than later, I think that that's important. And you know, they'll be able to execute on it as Ilda said, with us kind of checking in and continuing to monitor progress and things like that.
Perfect. I get a thumbs up from Jaime. Any other task force member? Jonathan, thank you. So as we're looking at this, I think it kind of being able to review the proposal and looking into discussions into next steps, sort of to formalize this. And I think it's going to be probably pretty time consuming for each one of us or all of the subcommittee members to join the meetings, you know, on a weekly basis. I think being able to either rotate ownership of meeting up with those individuals and being able to have an open meeting that it will have to be an open meeting if multiple members are actually a part of it. Multiple task force members are a part of it. So I think we can assign maybe individual leads for each one of the calls from this group and sort of rotate them in the 8-week span that we have for the contract. And then being able to open it for individuals to be able to join them for continuity, you know, next steps or maybe pieces that might have not been quite captured in the notes. Hopefully everything is captured in the notes. But I wanted to see if folks felt comfortable with that moving forward into check-ins with the contractor. Get a thumbs up from Jaime. Jonathan, I think that was a thumbs up, Jonathan, maybe? Yes, okay, cool. Kimberly. Okay, perfect. So subcommittee group, I think something that we can do, it's kind of randomly lay out our roster and then look at the individuals that be a part of it. And maybe as a follow-up, Natalie, kind of set up a schedule as we're kind of having conversations with the contractor to schedule a time and a day during the week to be able to have on a weekly basis that conversation. Does that sound good, Natalie?
That sounds great, and I can propose a schedule, and if any of the subcommittee members have conflicts, we can switch it around to work it around your schedule, understanding everyone's very busy. And I think it sounds like we don't need to take a formal vote, since we had a vote that the selection committee could come to a decision, and we've heard from several members of the selection committee proposing that we move forward with the Logan Simpson proposal. Just sort of for the notes in the record. Joel, is there anything else, any other things we need to, any formalities we should address, just since we are taking a contractual decision here?
I think we are set. It seems like we have the authorization from the task force to move forward, and you know, we as your staff will kind of do the formalization process of finalizing the negotiation of the scope of work with the vendor, and obviously make sure that the task force is appropriately brought in through those periodic check-ins and at the next subcommittee meeting to kind of oversee the work. But I think we have the official go-ahead from you all, so thank you for providing it.
Perfect. And I think in the length of the contract, we'll be able to have 2 subcommittee meetings in the meantime. So we'll be able to have one check-in, you know, a reporting out to all the rest of the subcommittee members. I think most of us are in the subcommittee anyways, but we're able to provide a formal report to also the community and then our next best practices meeting, and then in the upcoming ones. So we'll have 2 meetings in which we'll be able to report where the contractor is at. on the project.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ilda. And I may also recommend, as we actually negotiate and formalize the scope of work that we've prepared and turn it into a formal contract, we're a little past the original dates that I think we'd anticipated. I think we'd said it would start May 1st. So, given that, we can always ask for the contractor to do a final presentation at something like the July meeting. The subcommittee adjust the dates a little bit if we need to. That's not a problem for us to do, to make sure you all get the sort of appropriate report out at the right time. So
Fantastic. Any other items that folks want to elevate on the contractor before moving forward into our next item? Hearing none, then that will get us into our discussion of initial recommendations for best practices. In our last meeting, we were able to look at 3 of the recommendations on times, notice, and outreach tools. You can look at our notes and sort of some of the summary pieces that we're able to elevate from that. But today we would love to get your, and I think we did also a little bit of public input or outreach materials. I think we touched base a little bit of that in our last meeting, as we have some notes on that. But wanted to move it into public input, locations, and outreach materials as we're moving forward into that piece, and maybe open the conversation for us to discuss some of those items.
And I can set that, help set that context if that's helpful, Linda.
Please, Natalie, please, that would be very useful.
And I will just say, we got a little bit of a late start and we are right back on time. So way to go, everyone, to take that decision. Really appreciate that. What I'll do, similar to the presentation I shared at our last session, was just kind of remind us of where we are in these recommendations, make sure we're touching on some of the input you've already shared, and thinking about next steps. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, I've got 2 screens going. So, so similar to what I shared earlier, just to kind of walk us through where we are. Sorry, here we go. Having a hard time moving my slides. Sorry. Oh, there we go. So just to quickly remind ourselves of sort of the ambition and the innovation that the Environmental Justice Act calls for. Walk through the 6 best practices of community engagement, which I think everybody knows pretty well now. And then focus on, as Ilda proposed, the sort of last 3 of the group of 6, looking at methods for receiving public input, location, and outreach materials. That's what we'll work on focusing this evening. And I shared this before, and I'll share it again, and I'll probably do it again. But just to remind us of the goals that are articulated in the Environmental Justice Act when it comes to community engagement and disproportionately impacted communities, where we're really looking for ways that can help build trust and transparency, provide meaningful opportunities to influence public policy, and ultimately modify proposed state action in response to public input with a view to decreasing environmental burdens and increasing environmental benefits. The Environmental Justice Act also urges us to innovate, get creative, try new things. And so just wanted to reiterate some of these components and provisions from the Environmental Justice Act, so we know, and the subcommittee knows, that there's innovation and creativity invited by the Environmental Justice Act. So here are the 6 best practices that the subcommittee is here to discuss. At our last meeting in April, we started a conversation around time, notice, and outreach methods. And so tonight we'll focus on those last 3, just another breakdown of what we did last time, what we're doing this time. And so what I'd like to do is kind of go through, and I'd propose we have about 40 minutes for this part of the conversation. And if it works for all the subcommittee members and for the chair, I would propose that we give 10 minutes for conversation for each of these to really get feedback and try and stay focused first on the methods for receiving public input. And then we can shift gears into locations, and then we can conclude with outreach materials, looking for about 10 minutes each, and see how that goes. Can I just see sort of thumbs up if that feels like an okay way to proceed, particularly for the chair? Yes, thank you. But all committee members, great. So moving to methods for receiving public input. And I did put a link into, just so people don't feel like we're repeating ourselves, but Lubna pulled together the input that was received at the last Environmental Justice Action Task Force meeting of April 23rd, which includes some of these pieces. So that is there. And then because that is the subject matter and the focus of this subcommittee, I think there's a space here for us to dive into even more conversation. So the Environmental Justice Act suggests methods, identifying methods for receiving public input, and suggests these sort of bulleted lists that I put here. I noted in the notes from August 23rd that there's a call, some of the, one of the recommendations coming from the full task force was to consider providing additional methods for public input not currently listed in the statute, like hybrid meetings. And I think with that, maybe I'll stop sharing my screen. Let's see. Oh, I did have a few examples of some things we've been doing since the Environmental Justice Act was founded, was created in July. So thinking about how are we collecting and receiving community input. We've done some in-meeting polls using either Zoom or Slido. These are word clouds asking, you know, what is the greatest threat to air quality in your community? What are some of the important issues to you? We've also asked people, is this your first time to join us? Just so we kind of know who the audience is. Have you been joined an AQCC, an Air Quality Control Commission, or CDPHE meeting previously? And we sort of tried to pull some of these numbers together. Who's joining these meetings? Is it elected officials, first-time people? Ask them what made it easy to join, what made it hard to join, what can we do to make participation easier going forward? So these are kind of different levels of before, after, and during surveys that we've started using just as an example, just mostly because we want to continue our own learning curve, strengthening our practices. Yeah, and some more open-ended questions so people could really say this worked well, this didn't work well, which components were valuable to people who participated. So I think with that, I will stop sharing and turn it back over to Ilda to facilitate a conversation focused on the methods for receiving public input. And I think would be really helpful to hear from subcommittee members on what is missing or what is working, what could be strengthened. And thankfully Morgan is taking notes for us today. So we'll continue to build a growing document of your recommendations going forward. I'll hand it back to you, Ilda.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Yeah, so I think as we're talking about receiving public input and one of the pieces that we have seen through our Environmental Justice Task Force, community members being able to join in many instances, and maybe being harder sometimes even when they're joining in, that they can join in exactly at the time that they might have to, that they have to provide public comment. So looking at it, and I think looking into what Natalie called out, innovation in ways in which we can receive public input for community members outside of just public comment, and leaving the 30 minutes at the end of a meeting or at the beginning of a meeting to be able to address those comments, but want to elevate other ways that we have seen as best practices to receive input and recommendations from the community members. And I see that I see a few community members also in the meeting. So also if you would like to add in the chat any ways that might be easier for individuals to participate in this process, this subcommittee is created for you, by you. Well, I don't, maybe somewhat by you in a sense, but I think want to make sure that the practices also represent what you guys would like to see. So feel free to add some of those suggestions in the chat and to spark some more conversation and discussion. Maybe to spark a little of the conversation, if you guys have seen different methods of input and to be for community members to be able to provide information outside of public meetings, what have been one that maybe your agency has been able to utilize in the past, or being able to implement in different projects that you have seen.
So Ilza, can you, I'm sorry, you're looking for feedback on different ideas on how public can provide input, correct? Okay.
Correct.
You know, I'm coming from I guess an agency perspective, just from my past experience, some of the things that I've done on various projects, and I don't know if it's worked or not, but well, I can say it's worked, but in terms of the public thoughts around it, you know, I know that for me, it always depends on the project, the type of project, the size of the project. There's a lot of variances at play. But some of the things I've done were, you know, have open office hours, right? We may have a designated office space, and, you know, there's been a phone hotline that's been used before. I was on a project where folks could come into the office and we had staff that helped use tablets and helped them go through and answer questions or provide feedback. Also just an opportunity to sit with someone to talk verbally about their concerns or responses or input. And it was, you could do it out in the open or even available privately, right? Some folks maybe wanted to provide private feedback and not be in the public eye. So things like that. You know, email, of course, is always an option. Tags, I think that's what they're called, the things you can put on the doorknob to fill it out, and then staff would come by and pick it up, or you could drop it in a drop box. I've done something where we've provided people with documents that they can complete with envelopes that had postage so they could put it in the mailbox and it wasn't a cost to them. So that was something that I've done before. I don't know if this helps, but that's some of the stuff that comes to mind at the moment. I've just drank a whole bunch of Coke, so.
No, thank you, Marsha. We need all the energy that caffeine might have brought into your life right now, for sure.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Kimberly, were you gonna step in? Sorry.
Yeah, and I'm thinking through, because the times kind of, as Velma kind of put in the chat, like the times kind of, they make sense in terms of how we get public comment in terms of different times. So these kind of overlap a little bit. But one thing I'm struggling to figure out sort of what this looks like, but it's along the lines of what Marcia was talking about in terms of out of the box. In order to, you know, not everybody can come to a meeting, whether it's virtual or in person, and not everybody can, you know, has a lot of reliable access for electronic communication. And so I'm trying to figure out, is there sort of a mechanism, and it's kind of like your Dropbox. I like that idea of where, you know, people who are, you know, in their community, that they can drop it off with the local governments, and the local governments can come in and have a representative there to read the responses that they get back from their community members, or something to that effect, some kind of Dropbox. Because oftentimes too, if you get a whole stack of written things get overlooked. But if somebody is able to communicate that in person as a representative, I'm thinking, I'm on the Jefferson County Planning Commission, and we allow HOAs who have a designated representative from the HOA to have 10 minutes versus just 3 minutes, like the public comment. And I'm just wondering if maybe there's an opportunity, if a representative like the town manager or something from a local government would be willing to kind of bring all of this, together and communicate that at the state agency. It would give people an opportunity because they're closer to the local government than maybe, the agency offices.
Yes, thank you so much. Belma, would you like to engage in the conversation?
Sure, if it's okay to do so now, otherwise I can wait. One of the things that I think is really important in community meetings is, even though I agree that it's critical, the more different modalities of communication, as well as multiple times that can be available for people to provide input, the more likely it is that the more you increase the people that you get who are able to respond. But I think that it's, my experience has been that it's important to have at least some spaces in which members of a particular community are able to gather, either virtually or in person, together and hear each other commenting, because it increases the comfort level. I think for members of the community to not feel like they're sort of by themselves speaking, they gain confidence from hearing that their friends and neighbors agree with them, or may have similar concerns, even if they don't precisely agree. And I think that it's in the sort of move by a lot of agencies towards show and tell and one-on-one communication. I appreciate the benefit of being able to answer individual questions, but I think something is lost when members of the community are not able to build their power by speaking as a group together.
No, thank you so much, Ma. And I think what is being proposed is not replacing in-person meetings, but how many different modes we can get input from individuals. So I think we have seen in a lot of working families that showing up even to a meeting, even if it's at 5:30 or on the weekend, might be very difficult. But I love that idea, Marshall, sort of the door hangers, or being able to have individuals that are representative within those communities that can collect some of those stories to bring forward. Makes me think a lot about, thank you really, Belma. And it really makes me think about also how nonprofits and community groups can also being able to bring some of those comments. Working in those spaces, oftentimes there are surveys that are done to your membership or to individuals that maybe an organization is doing door knocking, and they might have a survey that entails some of these questions of like, why do you care about this project, or do you agree with this project? To me, it will be interesting on how we can also call in the different organizations that are doing also this work in the ground to bring some of the information that their membership or individuals that they advocate for might be elevating in this space. Joel.
Yeah, if it's okay to bring an example that I think relates to what you're saying, Yilda, of kind of a survey, and actually also relates to Kimberly's point about getting input from folks who can't make it to a meeting, and I think is sort of in many ways another version of Marsha's self-addressed stamped envelope with a question document. I'm not sure how familiar all of you are with the Suncor water permitting process that we've been overseeing here at the department, but our water quality control division is in the process of overseeing the public process for Suncor's water discharge permit renewal. So all large industrial sources that have discharge or runoff have permits essentially related to how much they can discharge into stream and rivers. So I think a challenge we often face as agencies is that we present members of the public with like a 500-page technical permit and then just say, give us your comments. And then if we don't get perfectly relevant comments on the technical matters, we can't always use them, right? Or we can use them, but in a different context, and it's hard to show kind of how we were responsive. So back in November, the Water Quality Control Division staff actually prepared basically a survey, I would call it, or a questionnaire similar to what I think Yilda was talking about, that had specific questions or actually statements on kind of specific areas where we really wanted or could use public feedback related to the permit, and then included that as one way to provide feedback to us in the permitting process. It was essentially a Google form that was on our website. So if someone didn't want to provide a formal written comment or come to a meeting and speak, they could still give us their input on some of the topics we'd identified as the agency as being most relevant. So I don't have that form. I think the form itself is no longer online, but we do have the responses that the people filled out, essentially a Google sheet where you can see the responses that I just put a link there in the chat on questions like, do you agree with the PFAS limit that we've identified? What do you think about the discharge limit for the Burlington ditch, and kind of asked specific questions. Unfortunately, the full question isn't in the spreadsheet, but that's one method we've used. And I don't have specific data on the effectiveness, but we could ask Erin Garcia or Meg Parrish from the Water Division to come share how effective that was, if it would be helpful, or I can work on tracking down the original survey if you all would like to see it.
Thank you so much, Joel. This is really helpful as looking at best practices that are out there that other agencies are using in this space. Thank you so much for that. Any comments on this kind of engagement previous to a meeting or as part of the community engagement piece?
Hilda, I have one more, and I don't know if this is the right place, and I don't know if we've covered this, but when I think about like the work that, or the space that I'm in, when I deal with projects, and specifically it's transportation, it's construction, right? I think something that's very critical is the timing of the outreach, right? It's the beginning of a project, in the middle, through construction. There are different phases where you can have different levels and types of outreach and engagement. And that's going to vary probably by different agency and the different type of project. But I do think that that's important, right? That depending on the type of project, there has to be a thought process around the timing, the timeline of when that outreach and engagement happens, which then actually sort of defines the type of outreach that you do. And the notices, someone in the chat, I think it was Ren, mentioned like the follow-ups, the notifications. I find that is also very critical too. So the timeline and how we follow through.
Yes, 100%. I don't think it's being able to elevate that input should not be just at the beginning phase of a project. That should be throughout the different spaces, and also tell community members, being able to inform community members what is the scope of the, of the actual input that can be being able to be given at that time. And we're in that scope of work, because I think as Joel was mentioning, I think sometimes we want to make sure that input is fully utilized. If it's, and we're in a very technical stage and we're not talking about the technicalities of it, community members can feel like that their comment might be dismissed, so it's not indicating that appropriate time or when it should be done. Thank you so much for that. Natalie, I see you on mute. I don't know if you had something to add.
Well, just thanks so much for that conversation and the input from everyone. And I wonder if the suggestion that Marcia just shared around the timing, which I think is different than sort of notice, sort of an announcement and the timing of the announcement. But I wonder if that's a best practice that needs to be that this committee could address further, or it's an additional piece that right now is not covered in the Environmental Justice Act in terms of both the early enough for it to be meaningful, engaged, but also over the course of the development of a project. So I don't have an answer. I'm just wondering where we want that to land.
Or like benchmarks of engagement, not so much only outreach, but what are the benchmarks and the different spaces that should be continuing to engage throughout the project. Tyson, welcome, co-chair of the Environmental Justice Task Force. I see that you have a comment.
Yes, thank you very much. And I apologize. I'm at a stoplight, so I can actually turn my video on for a second, but I am commuting right now, so I'm not going to be on video long. But I did want to make a few comments just in my personal experience through my work with various communities all over the country in my job space. And then one thing that I find that's extremely important is one, having multiple means to communicate, which very much like was said, you have to have a public arena for comments. You have to have a direct contact with the company that's doing the project to get details, and you also have to have, in my opinion, one of the most effective, it can be also the least effective if done incorrectly, is the local government designees, or somebody who they can talk to at the local government level, because oftentimes most regulatory systems will give that local government representative more attention in the space of a public hearing or a decision-making process. Now, I think where that can be improved is that also can change from one government to the next government, depending on how involved they want to get and how available or how comfortable the people feel with that designated person they put out there. But more importantly, I think in all of it, if you have a local government contact, you have a public arena to state your comments, and you also have a direct line to the company who's doing the project, is what is the boundary of that notification and who is being notified, I think is probably the most critical piece, because you can have the most robust communication process involved in these as you want, but if you're not notifying the right people, enough people, or the people who are being affected by it, it really doesn't matter. And that's one thing that we've really had struggled with in the past, is making sure that we're notifying all the right people. You know, the landowners are always notified, the immediate residents in the vicinity are always notified. They usually have a direct line to the company. They usually have more input than the rest of the community. If you want to do true community engagement, you got to make sure everybody has access to those same things. And that's how, in order to engage an entire community, you got to make sure the entire community is very well versed on the project, make sure they understand what the rules are.
He caught up for y'all too? Okay.
Sorry,
Tyson,
I had a call come in. It's very important that all of those details make it to the public, so the public can make those comments. And again, you know, is that boundary? Because you also don't want your entire public comment to be from people who are halfway across the state. You want the people who are living in that community to have the loudest voice when it comes to that. So how far do you reach out? That's a big question that needs to be answered, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Tyson. Really appreciate that comment. And I think that's getting us a little bit into outreach materials. I think that it's going to be really important, especially as you're mentioning that, all the landowners, everybody's well informed of what is actually put at what is at stake, and the people that are affected to know what are the actual issues at hand, to be able to provide a proper comment and really identify those individuals in the locality. And I think that's very valuable. I think being able to have all inputs on all spaces. I think it's interesting. I'll say for like community engagement overall, sometimes like a government agent might not be the most trusted voice to reach out to those individuals to participate and engage. And I'm curious, I think maybe this is transitioning us into like outreach materials and outreach information and sort of educational materials. And I'm transitioning us in the next item, because I know we're kind of on timely basis, but also would like to see if anybody has any final thoughts on public input before maybe moving into outreach materials.
I just want to say, I think you hit an important point right on the head, Hilda. And I just kind of have been experiencing a situation where some folks that I'm in communication with to hopefully invite them to join us for one of our other subcommittee meetings. They, even though they know me and have known me for some time, because of the connection to government, they have been very skeptical and like it even has been a little bit like ugly. Some of the things that they the ways that they have kind of treated me compared to before I was a part of the EJATF, and they just knew me as one of the community members, and that I not a community member in their community, but another community member from another disproportionately impacted community that was facing similar struggles, etc. And they've become very distrustful because I'm now reaching out to them as a member of the EJATF, which they have didn't take them much to figure out that was affiliated with CDPHE. So I think like I say, you've really touched on an important point that I didn't really think about until this experience, which is that, there are folks out there that have become extremely distrustful of government and industry. And that can be an issue, a barrier, and a major challenge that I'm not sure I know the answer to. But I mean, I will say that the situation with myself and my contacts has worked out favorably, and it looks like they will be joining us for our meeting. But it's a challenge that I think we need to keep in mind and maybe even have conversations about moving forward.
Thank you so much, Jaime. And I think I wanted to transition us into even outreach materials, because even who is the entity sending the outreach materials can really change somebody's perspective in engaging into the conversation, and being able to create kind of like an open, safe space for them to feel in that they can participate. So maybe that can be a conversation that we can start with here, and sort of who do we think will be the best communicator? Because according to who is receiving the information, who's the audience, the information is going to be received very differently. And Natalie, I see you're muted, so.
Well, if it's helpful, we have both location and outreach materials to address, but I'm not surprised that first one that we were spent more time on took more time, and I think there was a little bit of a buffer in our agenda for this evening, so I think we can still get through things. And maybe I can just read out the location, what we have in the Environmental Justice Act, so we sort of know what we're building on if we want to start with the location and then move into outreach materials. Does that work for you, Ilda?
I was just gonna switch them up rather than skip complete
Okay.
location, since the conversation kind of transitioned into outreach materials. I was just gonna keep that flow.
Let's-
But yeah, does that sound good?
Yeah.
Perfect.
So I'll just read out what we've got in the Environmental Justice Act for outreach materials. How about that? So the best practices of where we stand is as follows. Create outreach materials concerning the proposed state action in layperson's terms, translated into the 2 top languages spoken in a community, that inform people of opportunities to provide input on the proposed state action, their rights, the possible outcomes, and the upcoming public input process. So that is outreach materials.
So as I'm hearing from the act, you know, that really is the agency, the regulatory body that's kind of managing this, and I guess being thoughtful about what that looks like for the regulatory agency to do that. I do think, and maybe this is way beyond our scope, but you know, Jaime touched on it, Tyson touched on it a bit. Maybe, you know, we look at those outreach materials for the regulatory agency, but what do we have recommendations for the regulated industry or the regulated bodies to also have a certain type of outreach material, because the regulated body, the regulated, you know, entity is going to have to do community outreach on their own, separate from the agency. It doesn't sound like that's part of our scope in the act specifically, but it could be something that we should think about, or they align maybe with how the, you know, the agency does it versus how the permitter does it.
Yeah, I think for the regulated entity, it's really important to create those outreach materials. I'm curious though, if in a sense can somewhat become lobbying for their agency, depending on how the materials are displayed, rather than becoming an educational material, which I think it creates of what that mistrust can be even further, that community members might have from even governmental agencies, more or less to the agent, or not the agency, the company, or that might be regulated, or the agency that might be regulated. And like, just per se, you know, things coming out of CDPHE around Suncor Refinery versus the information coming from Suncor Refinery to community members of what is happening in the ground, that could be somewhat be seen as lobbying rather than educational.
Yeah, I'm thinking, and I hear you, Ilda, but one thing I'm thinking is, I mean, and it was kind of goes along with what Marcia was saying, which I think is a really important component, which is, if you're doing a new project, it's really important to notify the community at different phases and different stages of the project. And so the permit holder, so to speak, if that's what we want to call them, or the regulated body, whoever that is, they're going to have that information. They're going to know where they are, or when they're starting a new phase, or, you know, if something's changed within the timeline. And so I think that there has to be some level, because the permitting process is going to require a community engagement. There's just, that's the way permitting processes work. And so the person, the entity that's securing that permit is going to have to do some level of engagement to tell the community the timeline of their project, the phases of their project, and the regulator, CDPHE, isn't going to be able to do that after the permit's approved. And so I think that, but I do think that's an important aspect of outreach materials, that throughout the process of the project, the community should be notified of different phases of the project.
Dominique.
Hi. Yeah, and I'm getting back to that question of trust and sort of distrust, and just thinking about if the regulator is not trusted, somebody like some trusted entity is needed to provide that information about like what the likely impacts are, right? Because you can't really leave that to the regulated entity, whoever's wanting to get the permit or be able to move forward with the project. And then, on the other side, there might be other third parties that also might not always spread accurate information. I know like disinformation has become a much bigger problem altogether. And so I guess I'm just worrying if like there's anything we can do in terms of giving guidance for how to have sort of some sort of verified source of information, is there any sort of, not sure if anyone has any kind of best practices, but I guess I am just worried about disinformation from multiple sides.
I muted myself instead of muting. Yeah, I agree 100%. I think and I think that's what a lot of community members are afraid of, disinformation by permit holders or entities are, in the permitting process, of how accurate that information is, or how accurate the data is, how recent the data is that it is provided actually to individuals on the project that's going to be at hand. So I know that we're tasked with primarily working with the agencies to provide that information as some of these processes are getting started. And I've seen that a lot of the times, not just like CDPHE, and a lot of these agencies can be a regulatory agency sort of in being able to sort of proofread or sort of being able to kind of dismantle some of that disinformation that can be provided in some of those spaces. I'm curious if that has been something that has been presented in the past, Joel, as working with different permitting agencies when it comes to providing, if there has been misinformation that you guys had to edit in the past, or say, actually, this is not the accurate to the most recent data that we have on, the amount of pollutants that are being put in the air or whatever it might be. I'm curious if that has been a time that CDPHE or any of these agencies had to be sort of like a checks and balance. And I say a lot, for example, during the census campaign, and this is just a fact example, but there was so much disinformation on the internet that Facebook as an entity became a reviewing entity of that information. And anything that might have been misinformation could be taken down immediately. So I'm just curious, like, who could be the regulatory agency of the information if it's adequate?
I don't know if I can provide a perfect answer to that question, Ilda, but I think maybe less than the types of intentional disinformation campaigns that might have been experienced around something like the census. I think it's common, is my understanding, that there could be disagreements between the regulated entity seeking a permit and us as a permitting agency about especially things like an emissions calculation that goes into a permit, where there's one method, for example, used for estimating emissions by the regulated entity, and our permitting staff actually thinks, well, your method left this thing out, or we looked back at the data and there was a certain number of upsets with that unit and we should account for increased emissions or something like that. So that's a non-trivial amount of the work, honestly, our permitting team does, is review the information that's submitted as part of a construction or operating permit in the air division, or a discharge permit in the water division, or a hazardous materials or solid waste facility permit application for our hazardous materials and waste management division. And I think it tends to be more kind of scientific and technical disagreements. But I think to the broader point, the recommendation that you all are charged with making involves what types of information should be provided for a proposed state action. In the definition of proposed state action, it does include permits. It also includes rulemakings and enforcement actions that, at least as currently in the Environmental Justice Act, would go before the Air Quality Control Commission for some reason. But I think it's worth noting that in the situation that maybe I think Kimberly was alluding to with the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, part of what it requires regulated entities to do is engagement, and often there's engagement above and beyond that minimum requirement for kind of a whole project perspective, right? Like the Oil and Gas Commission is approving operations as a whole, whereas when we, and so obviously the project timeline and phase is sort of part of what COGCC by regulation and guidance requires or encourages operators to share kind of what's going to happen when. And I'm forgetting the exact details. Kimberly probably knows them better, but that's actually not something we necessarily require as part of our own permitting practices in our more environmental regulatory context. So to the best of my knowledge, something like an operating permit for an air facility, even if it's a new facility, might not say what's the timeline for when this is going to be built and when it's going to be in operation. And as far as I know, that's not part of our water quality information and either, or I'm less familiar, I'm sorry, with the hazardous waste and solid waste permitting. So something for you to think about is there room for encouraging a regulated entity to kind of share that type of information, either itself through the permitting process and kind of share what its timeline is and what the project overall scope is, instead of just the narrow questions about emissions or discharge or hazardous materials management? Or is it more appropriate for that to happen in a context like the Oil and Gas Commission that is thinking more holistically about a project, or a local government land use decision that's deciding kind of whether a facility can be located in a specific place? So I think I want to bring us back maybe in that way to Kimberly's point too, of kind of when and how should that be what the EJ Act considers for the types of decisions that are made by environmental agencies like us at CDPHE.
Thank you, Joel. Really appreciate that answer. Maybe directing folks a little bit to sort of as we have talked about it, and I don't know if folks have any thoughts around kind of the information or the plan of outreach from the individual seeking or the company seeking a permit. But looking into a messenger component for this, would we like to propose that maybe the messenger in a lot of this communications or sort of outreach materials doesn't necessarily have to be the agency in many cases? I know within the outreach plan, there could be the possibility of encouraging different nonprofits or organizations that are working closely to the department to be able to elevate some of these pieces as they're trusted members of the community. I'm curious if that would be a piece, and I know at times there's a budget associated to those outreach kind of or practices and tactics that need to be implemented. Would that be something that would be useful if there is an amount of granted to community groups to be able to do the outreach and be able to be trusted in the community? As I know at times many organizations have to seek specifically those funds to allocate within their organization to provide and staff time capacity to be able to do some of that work of reaching out further the masses around permitting process or any kind of outreach engagement. in educational work. I see a nod, Jaime. Maybe, yes. Okay. Is there anything that you would like to add in regards to that, or something that would be useful? As I know, as you mentioned, like even within this role, there can be a little bit of mistrust, even though we have been, you know, part of the community and being advocates in the community, that even within these roles, there can be a little bit of mistrust. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on track with that. I think that you know, those of us who've been working in the communities already can be sometimes make that bridge. And even though I did have to you know, just be patient and absorb a little bit of abuse, you know, it worked out in the end. And I think that we're going to be able to hear from some folks that may have some good input, because I was able to make that you know, bridge that gap and hopefully bring them into our space in a welcoming way. So I think you're on the right track, and thinking of, you know, folks that are already in the communities doing the work, already have relationships with the communities, and have a little bit of, you know, at least a little bit of trust already built up. I think that's a good start, at least a good starting point.
Thank you, Jaime. And I think to Tyson's comment, and I think even Marcia's idea of being able to do a mailer, I think being able to do an initial outreach to individuals advising what's happening, I think it's probably more ideal for it to be an official document from the unit or the department that is driving some of that input. But then what it looks like in that individual outreach, sort of that is not just seen as like a massive or mass mailer and engagement, but what it is sort of those individual conversations that create trust and actually turn out people to those hearings or turn out their voices and stories. Marcia, I see your hand up.
Yeah, so this one I'm trying to process this, and I hope I say this correctly and it's in the right place. But again, I can only speak from my perspective, which deals with a lot of construction, right? I don't know if there's ways you can mandate or require, because you may have contractors, consultants that are working on projects. And so you can have outreach that comes from the agency, but from a prime perspective, a prime would also be doing a lot of the outreach in those communities of where they're building. So you could have multiple layers of outreach for one particular project. So I think that there could be, or there needs to be some alignment with agency and their contractors or consultants, whoever they hire, right, to oversee these projects, are also doing that outreach. And they are doing it in alignment with what the expectation is from the agency. Does that make sense? Like, well, you have to have some partnership there, because if you just have your contractor or consultant doing their own outreach, who knows? Like, because I heard the term, like, there's some misinformation, and I apologize. I have not experienced that, not to say that it doesn't happen, but if you don't have that alignment or partnership between agency and their contractor or consultant, I could see how that happens. So there needs to be something that maybe says, ensuring through a project, if there is a company, contractor, whatever level and what they do, there is some partnership there and they're on the same page. Maybe they're partnered together. You know, I've done projects where you do that, but I know there are times where that doesn't happen. So I think that alignment is important.
Yeah, and I think that we're talking, I think there is like a contractor that it's contracted by the agency, you know, in order to be able to deliver a project in which they should be, and maybe this is a request that we should be making, that there should be from these different contractors, just a plan when it comes to an outreach plan, you know, a language just plan and a outreach materials that will be provided that should be, just as we're like reviewing these contracts for our focus groups, that the agency will be able to oversee. I think the piece that we're highlighting of misinformation could be on permitting projects, which is a little bit of a different case rather than an operational contract on how, you know, how the contract is going to be implemented versus petitioning for a permit in which the state has a stake in if it gets approved or not, and there is, it's not a, you know, it's not an approved contract yet. Or maybe
Okay.
Joel, if I'm, or Joel and Natalie, maybe if I misinterpreted that piece, but I think that's where I see the different kind of spaces. It's one that we're already working with this contracting agency, and I don't think we're going to be doubting too much the information, but I think it's sometimes in those permitting projects that have not been approved quite yet, and there are high stakes for those people that are being affected in the ground, that information could be differently displayed. And I think Joel indicated that during that information there is a little bit of alignment when it comes, or reviewing the materials and reviewing the pollutants that are put in there, and there might be technicalities of how the agency will see it versus the permitting and the entity that's seeking the permit.
Okay, well, sorry if I chimed in at the wrong thing, but
no,
yeah,
that's great. But I think that's a very important distinction that we need to make in our heads, that there's so many different kinds of engagement that happen across the board. And I think maybe, as you know, in the activist space, we normally lead a lot of with the, you know, the permitting process rather than a contract that's already in, you know, it's underway, but then how it's implemented might be put in question through the outreach or through the engagement of the community. Kimberly, it looks like you might have something to say, or Marsha, I think you just came off mute.
Oh, let me mute myself, sorry.
Okay, don't worry.
I wonder, Ilda, if we could take 5 minutes on location, and again, this is not the only chance for this input. What I can do following everything we've heard tonight, which has been so important and helpful, is pull together a document that could be editable for all subcommittee members for best practice for community engagement. So everyone can kind of sit with the language and take a look at some of the recommendations that are coming out. Also keeping in mind that the focus groups are also going to help inform what this subcommittee comes forward with. And so this is, again, this is not the end of the process, but we do want to continue to kind of collect input and continue this conversation for all of our sessions. But if we could take 5 minutes on location, that would be terrific if folks are open to that. And then take a quick break. And I think I did, let me see, I hope it's in here. So here's the language that's in the EJ Act around location, speaking to consider using a variety of locations for public input on the proposed state action, which could include meeting locations in urban centers or neighborhoods whose populations are predominantly Black, Indigenous, or people of color, or have an income below the state's average, or in rural locations in various regions of the state. So this is assuming an in-person world in terms of how the language was written. But it'd be great to get some more input from everyone on location. And let's see, the input we received already from many of you spoke to the importance of some of the characteristics of the location, that it would have free parking, it would be a safe location, it would have access to public transportation, near bike paths, maybe locations where local businesses can economically benefit from the meeting. So I think none of this is terribly surprising because this is your input, but I kind of wanted to put it out there as a foundation for an initial conversation.
Thank you so much, Natalie. So I know we have elevated not just location being in person, but being able to have remote options of being able to participate, and preferably a hybrid mode that it can be easily accessible for individuals. I think in one of our very first meetings, we talked about kind of how sometimes hybrid meetings we might feel like they're hybrid, but for individuals, undecided. And if it's a meeting, it's happening in person, and if the camera setup, the audio is not quite great, then you end up just kind of hearing a muffled conversation on the side and not feeling like you can actually participate adequately in those spaces. I know that has been something that we have elevated, and that if it is chosen an allocation that's hybrid, that it has the technology set up to be able to accomplish it. So an example is like city council meetings now that most states have, most cities, they have a great setup in order to capture council members in camera and audio. But curious about locations as we're looking at also like in-person meetings, especially for statewide engagement overall, especially permit projects that might be statewide. Do we want to elevate sort of kind of, in a lot of instances, this can be broken down, the state of Colorado can be broken down by regions, and a lot of people have stated being able to have a meeting maybe in one of the, at least in one of the regions, or each one of the, at least one meeting in each one of the regions in which is elevated. I seen in other spaces that they would rather not have if meetings in person, if the meetings are over so many miles away from a community, that community can't participate in them. So I'm curious if folks have any thoughts or any ideas on statewide engagement, primarily when it comes to locations for meetings. Do we feel like everything that's an EJ Act is just square away? We don't have any comments on locations?
I think Ilda regionally is, I mean, I think there does have to be some aspect of that. I mean, I recognize that we can't, particularly for a statewide action, the agency can't be go to everywhere, but I think regionally that's important. And I don't know, I mean, I know I've participated in state task force and other types of things that the agency does, if it's a statewide matter, schedule meetings in different regions. And I know that was pre-COVID. So I know a lot of us are going back a long ways, but I mean, I think that was, at least some state agencies were doing that form of communication and community outreach and meetings regionally. And I think that's important to bring back, quite frankly, if that isn't happening. And I don't know, Joel, if that was happening with CDPHE, but I know other state agencies were doing things like that for big state rulemakings and things like that.
I'll just say that that's probably a good question for me that unfortunately I don't know the answer to, because I am also new to CDPHE during the pandemic era. Actually, Natalie, you may be more experienced with that from your longer term work of engaging with CDPHE and also your work in the Attorney General's office representing CDPHE. So I don't know if you have perspective on how common it was for us as the state health department to kind of do engagement meetings around the state, especially on things like rulemakings that had a statewide impact.
I mean, I think historically it was the exception to convene meetings sort of around the state. I think I might get the year wrong, but there was Oil and Gas Rulemaking and the Air Quality Control Commission convened in-person meetings at 3 different locations across the state, and it was a really big deal, and like 100 people would show up for it, and I think it changed, had an impact on the tone and the outcome of that rulemaking because there were so many voices who came out to share their experiences. So I think that was the exception, and I think we're hoping as we move towards, certainly as we move towards being able to convene more in person, that it becomes more the norm. And looking at Dominique, but right now, working with several agencies, we're convening the GHG roadmap process, which is in 8 different counties over the course of the next 2 or 3 months. So a really ambitious, aggressive, diverse effort. And then there'll also be 2 virtual meetings. So really hoping that we're not going to connect to every single person in the state, but we're going to have an opportunity that might have been somewhat convenient or accessible to more people than if we were just doing in person or just doing a few, virtual. So.
To add to that, one thing that's on my mind, and I feel like I'm just asking more questions for this group than providing solutions, but if especially we talked about earlier about having multiple chances for input, right? That before you kind of go too far down the agenda, and then having the opportunity for community to provide input later on in the process. And one thing that does come to mind in feedback we've heard from that very first meeting that Natalie was referring to is that it's a question of whether or not if you have maybe, budget or the ability to do 2 rounds, do you go to the same place twice, or do you try and spread it out and hit different locations? And so that's kind of a hard question because my initial thought would be, okay, try and go as many different places and hear from as many different people as you can. On the other hand, there is sort of that element of needing to build trust. And when you show up in a community once, every however many years and don't come back, there's not that sort of trust building or sort of that relationship building or continuity of information and education and those other things that you're providing. So I guess I do feel like although you are there's advantage in trying to hit as many different places and give opportunity to as much of the state as you can, there's also some advantage when possible to try to show up in a community more frequently. So just one more kind of question.
No, thank you so much, Dominique. And I think maybe that's where I was coming out with the kind of regional engagement, because you can have one in the West Slope, but it could be in 2 different cities within the West Slope. So, and if you're coming back and rehitting that community or that demographic in that space, but it is in like 2 different cities that it provides input or possibilities for people to travel to those if need be. And I think, but that's where I was mentioning, like looking at how many miles people will have to travel for those different meetings within that region. That could be useful for engaging, and 100% agree. I think it's very difficult to be able to have those conversations if there is not trust built. So I'm curious, is even before starting plans, if outside of large input meetings, if there's possibilities for even smaller focus groups before even having a larger meeting, or kind of for follow-up, being able to do some of the focus groups after a large meeting that can kind of create further relationship building in those spaces and trust, really. Okay. I know we're hitting the time mark for us to transition into our next into our break. And then we'll about checking about our community voices and then timelines for the calendar. I know we're going to continue to have these conversations on locations and as Natalie mentioned, this conversation is not over, as being able to really pinpoint specific recommendations for the task force overall. But any final words around location? Thank you. And Dominique, we'll love after you guys do this engagement, maybe best practices or practices that you guys got out of this space, because I think
Yes.
you guys are putting it into practice right now and really thinking about what that authentic engagement can look like. And I think that will be really helpful as we set final recommendations. And
Yes, for sure. I feel like we learned so much from just one meeting, and we have a couple more coming up. So I'm happy to provide input that we're hearing.
perfect. Thank you so much.
I wonder, Ilda, if I could maybe make a proposal for kind of our time management for the remainder of our time. I think a 10-minute break would be great right now to allow everyone to stretch legs and care for kids or whatever we've got going on in our background. But I propose if we could come back at 6:25, we'll just take a glance at the calendar and sort of next steps. And then I wonder if the agenda item, checking in on community voice, might actually kind of be a discussion topic for us and community members during the public comment period, if that works. I don't want to take away time for community members to share public comment, but it doesn't look like there are many folks on the line. So I wonder if it can be a little bit of a prompted discussion, if that works for folks. And this check-in on community voices is really thinking about, are there other speakers we want to bring in that could help inform this conversation, but also what could subcommittee members be doing to bring in more members of the public to be part of these conversations. We're kind of at this pivotal moment for the state for environmental justice, and we're wondering how, and this is, Marcia helps formulate some of these questions as well, so she might want to kick it off when we come back from our break. But if that seems okay, maybe thumbs up from folks if shaking up the agenda feels all right. Obviously, if people do show up for a public comment, we will prioritize that, but great, I see a couple thumbs up. Thanks, everybody. I don't want to cut into our break, so how about we come back in 10 minutes?
Perfect. And I'm going to copy paste right now the agenda or sort of the timeline so folks can take a look at it, and it can be a little shorter when we come back. Thank you.
Bianca.
Hello. Hey, folks, just giving a 1-minute warning before heading back here. I don't know if you got a snack or took care of your tiny ones, either furry or child form. Yeah, we'll be gathering in a minute or so. Okay, we're at time. If subcommittee members and task force members can give a thumbs up or come back on camera, that'll be fantastic. Okay, I think no folks are coming back. So Natalie, I don't know if you want to get us started with the timeline.
Sure, sorry about that. Hi, everybody, welcome back. This is the same calendar I shared at our April meeting, and it shares the same dates that Ilda put in the chat. So hopefully this is familiar, but just to kind of remind everyone of where we are in terms of meetings. And I would say for the next meetings on May 31st and then on July 5th, those, as Joel alluded to, will likely be meetings where we'll want to bring in the contractor from the focus groups. There'll be many meetings in between as well, but in terms of making the most of those meetings, I would imagine we'll be pretty focused on some of their findings and ongoing work. And you can sort of see we sort of laid out looking and thinking of gathering your recommendations for the best practices, the 3 we addressed in April, the 3 we addressed today. Again, we will continue addressing them and continuing to iterate and receive input and recommendations on those best practices for community engagement. I think that was it. I can stop sharing now so we can see each other more, and I'm happy to share out this slide deck or this calendar just so people, if it's helpful for people to have the dates. I know for me, it's kind of helpful to just see into November because I know this is one tiny piece of your very large portfolios of work, I'm sure. So I think that was it there. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Well, with that, I think this will kind of drive us into our public input or our public input session, or our public comment. But I think as part of this, I think our last item that I think we'll like to also discuss with community members, we have brought different speakers from different communities to this space to talk about their best practices in the communities that they engage on in the different demographics. Also even best impacts that we have seen in focus groups and how to really make them adequate and being able to make them supportive of really getting that adequate data that we need to make sure that we're providing and those best practices and reaching out to individuals, not just kind of the low-hanging fruit in those focus groups. But as part of that, we would like to have sort of 2 speakers being able to join each one of our meetings. And I know we have had members from Latino bilingual community, making sure and talking about kind of that input. We had Representative Sandra Young from the NAACP Denver chapter talking about engaging Black communities in the Denver metro area. So want to elevate of different speakers or entities that we should be reaching out to come into this space to talk to us about best practices of engaging in those communities. I know some spaces that we have not talked about has been within the disability community to be able to have the most access to these spaces. And that's not just linguistic, the access that we should be creating on locations and time, but it might be practices that need to be implemented. So really wanted to have a roll call again for task force members of input of different speakers that could be brought into this conversation or demographics that we have not thought about or brought into this conversation. And once again, I'm gonna copy paste our community engagement thought leaders spreadsheet. We have kind of shared it around a couple of times for individuals to be able to input folks and leaders in the community that will be ideal for us to bring into this space. Also, this is open for community members. If you have suggestions of individuals, demographics that we have not reached out or talked about, that you think will be great speakers or individuals to bring into the subcommittee.
Hey, Ilda, I thought I submitted a few names, maybe I didn't, but I will add it again. Or
Please,
maybe I
please.
didn't on the document.
Yes, please feel free to add them to the document. We'll make sure to review it. And that's sort of how we're looking at in our sort of chair meeting that I have once a month with Natalie, Lovna, and the EJ unit. We normally review this and see who we can bring. If not, I normally kind of reach out to some individuals within my network.
Hilda, if it's all right, I'll just kind of kick off one discussion, and that is, can we get a presentation on maybe some of the elements that have created the mistrust through the state systems over time? Because I know there's a lot of different things that have contributed to it. Some of them I'm aware of, some of them I'm sure I'm not aware of. But is there, because I think understanding where the mistrust is coming from will help us in our way forward in trying to overcome that. That's not going to be something that's going to happen overnight, but you got to start somewhere.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you, Tyson. I'm curious, I think maybe there could be a couple of folks that are representing either the environmental justice coalition that will be ideal to bring into this space. I'm curious, Jaime, I know you play a lot within the environmental justice sort of coalition. So I'm curious if you might have some people that might be interested in talking about that, or any community members in the ground that will be ideal, that maybe they had some issues in the past. But I do agree that I think maybe a historical context will be great to have sort of like a presentation on the historical context of some of those issues. I think maybe some of the community members in this space could elevate those, but also even just from an environmental justice standpoint. But yeah, Jaime, I don't know if you have any thoughts or anybody that comes to mind.
Thank you, Hilda. I think I probably can come up with some names. Let me give it some thought. Yes, Velma, that's a great suggestion. Teresa Trio, who is in health equity organizer here in the Pueblo area. If we can, she's very busy, so if we can find time, that would be our biggest challenge there. And I'm sure I can come up with some other names. Let me just think about it. Thanks, Velma.
Yeah, I could think about a couple other members within the EJ coalition or representing other groups. I think Lucy Molina will be fantastic. I know she's been part of our at-large task force meeting, providing input. Though I'm trying not to keep it so metro area centric. So that's where I'm like having some issues of thinking people outside of just the metro area as well. Also, yeah, and want to call out to community members if you might have any thoughts or ideas of individuals that could come and speak, or even if you had a personal experience of a moment in distrust, even from community that you organize, or yourself in this space of maybe having distrust in the governmental agencies or the individuals seeking permits, for example.
One of the other things that I wanted to mention earlier too was something that's, you know, and I would love to hear from somebody from this particular group, but I helped create the Energy Advisory Board on the West Slope many years ago when we were working through oil and gas operations in the community there. That was made up of local community members, local government members, as well as members of industry to really listen and help make sure everybody was educated not only on industry, but what was going on in the communities, what was going on with community development, what was going on with a lot of different things. I don't know how successful it's been, but I know that they still hold meetings regularly, and that was back in 2006, I think that started. So for them to be going strong after that many years, I got to think that there's something we can learn from them, either what's worked or what hasn't. And maybe I can reach out and see if one of the community members from that, who's been part of that for a while, can maybe give us some insight on what's worked, what hasn't worked. You know, where there needs to be improvement, because I think having opportunities to come together outside of just asking for a permit is something that needs to be thought about as this goes forward.
Thank you so much, Tyson. Yes, if you would like to, I can reshare here the link to the spreadsheet. If you would like to add them, we're more than happy to connect with them, or if you would like to do any introduction for the EJ unit and myself, we're more than happy to reach out. Velma, I see you have your hand up.
Yep. A couple things, just in terms of groups to reach out to. I'm really glad to hear you mention the community of people with disabilities, Ilda. And in that community, I personally have not so much an individual to suggest, but I have personal concern for people with hearing impairments. And so not just making sure that we have the capability for the live transcript and so forth in the meetings, but and I'm, like I said, I'm not sure who in Colorado would be the right person to ask, but how do we make sure that the community of people with disabilities, such as hearing impaired people, have are made aware of the opportunities for engagement, and and thinking about the transportation barriers that they might face in addition to just like building related barriers. And if we're going to have live meetings, in-person meetings, what additional facilities are needed when there are in-person meetings for people with communication limitations as well as mobility limitations. I think if I might just say a word about the experiences that can lead to mistrust and distrust, and I think it's a matter of a lot of times it's a matter of inconsistencies, of discrepancies between what's said and done in public meetings and public hearings, and then when the permits come out or when the monitoring comes out, when results become available, the concerns of communities are summarized and written off. And communities with chronic health problems, communities that have lived with noise and odor and bad smells and water pollution, air pollution, and then when they're invited to a meeting, but then when they get there, the opportunities to speak are few and limited, and the end result seems to be the same. They get told, well, you know, your evidence is anecdotal, which means, you know, which signifies storytelling, and I don't mean like making things up, but I mean it's just stories, so we can't really do anything with it. And so people go away feeling ignored again. We've had several such situations in Pueblo, and you know, different representatives from agents from the same agency or different representatives from the same corporation will come and say different things. Oftentimes I think it's a matter of one hand not knowing what the other hand is doing rather than an attempt to deliberately mislead a lot of the time. But the end result is the same. How is it that we're having communities like those in North Denver and in Pueblo still having to address these issues? And I've said in hearings where people came from the oil and gas area and testified about their experiences, and even brought data from, you know, if they didn't bring data, then they were told, oh, you didn't bring data. And when they brought data, they were told, oh, your data is just from over-the-counter air monitors, so it doesn't count. And so taking the community seriously, taking the information the community has to share seriously, and treating the community as respected partners in the process. After all, the whole regulatory process is about, no offense, having the privilege of polluting in people's neighborhoods rather than spending the money to not pollute. So the community members, we should be treated as partners rather than as complainers or supplicants. And so I think that is a long-term relationship. It's not one thing that happened last week that caused the problem.
Thank you so much, Belma, for your statement, and maybe just answering one of them. I think as you're elevating for communities with disabilities, I think it will be great maybe for us to bring the Colorado Cross Disability Coalition. Actually, Kenneth Maestas, I believe he's the ED or CEO. I don't know what his title is, but he's part of the Health Equity Commission, and he does a lot of work in health equity spaces. I will say maybe something that we should think about as you're talking about hearing impaired individuals. Should we include sign language? That's something that should be added in in-person meetings, and possibly in Zoom meetings to be able to add it. I know we have the closed captions, but closed captions, at times, especially for visibly impaired individuals, it's just very difficult. So definitely thank you so much for that. And on your feedback, I think it's so important that we're bringing in community in every step of the facet of any project. Sort of as Marcia was mentioning, sort of the different benchmarks and the phases of the project. But I think also being able to really state to community what are the parameters in which this input can really be, brought in, what information, what data can be brought into these spaces. And yes, I think community monitoring, sometimes it's not seen to the same regard as monitoring that might be done by some of the agencies or the permitting entities. So I think that's something that I think we have here in different instances. I think when we had one of the members from Cultivando present, they elevated sort of sometimes having that difficulty in those issues of their data being taken just at the same regard as the permitting agencies.
Right.
Anybody have any other thoughts or any other community members that would like to participate and provide some feedback?
Ilda, to the last point, I might just add, as your staff, I think we are actually bringing in a scholar who is a environmental lawyer. She's had sort of decades of experience as an air pollution lawyer in the Environmental Defense Fund, and now focuses on the intersection of disability and environmental law with an eye towards environmental justice. Her name is Pam Campos, and she's actually one of my sort of professional mentors. So she's coming to speak with us about the years. Oh, you know her, so okay.
Please, would love to make that connection, and that we can bring also normally for just so you know, folks, we try to bring at least 2 speakers. So somebody even that might be working in part of a nonprofit or an individual community member, and then somebody might be from an agency. So I think being able to have a diversity of voices coming into the space are super great in their different perspectives.
Yeah, we would be happy to follow up with her to maybe be a second speaker in addition to the representative from Colorado Cross Disability Coalition. I think her area of focus is really more on how we talk about the health impacts that can be caused by environmental pollution, many of which are disabilities, and in doing so in a way that is sort of sensitive and in recognition of that. So I think she would be a good kind of pair to someone talking more directly about access issues like the Person from Cross Disability Coalition.
Thank you so much. So at least we have a set of individuals that we can reach out, or maybe thinking about our next meeting, thinking about individuals with disabilities. I want to hear more like outside of them. I know I keep saying this, but outside of the Denver metro area, I feel like in so many regards, a lot of folks in this space have a lot of connections in the Denver metro area. And I definitely, it's a space that I have some connections, but not all the connections in that space. And would love to hear if anybody has any suggestions, folks outside of the Denver metro area in different communities. Or if it's just talking about like what is the difference of reaching out to folks in rural areas. Thank you so much, Tyson, for joining us. Okay, well, thank you so much, folks, for participating in this conversation. We'll love more of your suggestions to be able to reach out to folks in this space. But also want to make sure that we're opening the space for members of the community if they would like to provide any comments outside of just like who should we bring into this space. I know Belma, you have provided some comments, and I think it's been a fantastic conversation. Ren, I don't know if you have any thoughts or any comment that you wanted to provide specifically. Sorry that I'm directly calling on to you. Just we have a smaller crew today to join us in public comment.
No, don't be sorry. And yeah, I'll chime in real quick, and sorry to be off camera. I'm multitasking a little bit, trying to make dinner. But yeah, thanks for having me. For those that don't know, my name's Ren Smith. I use he, they pronouns, and I organize in North Denver on clean energy issues. And so, yeah, I guess like my kind of interest in joining this subcommittee in particular is a lot of my work revolves around supporting community members to engage at the Public Utilities Commission. And I guess I've just kind of like over a year and a half-ish of kind of like helping people to get past some of those barriers. Like I've observed a lot of things that are kind of out of line with the like 6 like best practices for community engagement that we kind of shared like at the top of the meeting. So I am definitely happy to speak more to specific things or to connect y'all with community members that have like given public comments at the PUC over the last year or so on some of these things. But I mean, from the very basic things of like nothing is translated in Spanish to like there's no follow-up emails when people register for hearings, particularly at the statewide hearing, which, thankfully we were able to overcome these barriers, and it was actually a really, really great turnout. But at the statewide hearing on XL's ERP last winter, like people didn't get joining information for a Zoom call until like less than half an hour before they were supposed to be logging on. So it's lots of things like that that stack up. And then, yeah, we have to factor in the distrust from community members. I think one thing that I'm not sure if people mentioned in specific, but one thing that I've heard a lot, especially from our Latino communities, is like people just feel unsafe in general. It's not just about like environmental issues or about like, showing up to give public comments in that process, but like the distrust of government goes back to like immigration issues. Like there's so many things that kind of compound and add to this problem. And then when you have all of the logistical things on top of it, and people aren't sure if these decision makers actually listen to their comments, it's a lot of work that we organizers and community advocates and NGOs put in to get people to these kinds of hearings. And honestly, I don't, from my perspective, really think that very many people would know how to show up if it wasn't for that. So yeah, I always think about all the things that we could do if we weren't using our time to like get people to these hearings too. Like in an ideal world, I think that that should be the job of the people that get to like sit back and listen to community members. But yeah, I guess like real quick, that's my 2 cents, and I'm happy to also like come back with some examples and some more folks if this is something that y'all are curious to hear more about as it relates to the PUC.
Thank you so much, Ren, for your comment. I think it's so important to elevate the fear that has been established just with the government period, rather than just governmental agencies that history continues to be brought into so many of these spaces, even though it might be the easiest way that we can set it up. But I think how can we create spaces that individuals maybe can feel safe through maybe anonymous comments that can be provided. I think a lot of people feel a little fearful of like, is my name going to show up in some random list, in which, you know, it just becomes a fear overall in so many communities that I think it's so important to elevate. And I think for this subcommittee, maybe some food for thought of how are we talking about, we talk about outreach materials and educational materials, but what are summary and follow-up materials that should be provided to community members after a meeting, even if it is a summary of how many people came and testified, how many people were representing different entities, NGOs, etc., or, you know, kind of being able to provide those summaries or those pieces that people can feel like not only they were like taking notes on, but analyze and taking into serious consideration. It's a great point for us to discuss in the future. Yeah, I will say that that's one of, I think, the biggest pieces that makes it makes it difficult for community members to engage. I will say, right, NGOs and community activists, I think even as we're thinking about these best practices of community engagement, there is because there is so much lack of trust with the governmental agencies, I don't think that space in a short term in which, you know, NGOs and activists wouldn't be a part of the outreach and engagement plan to support this outreach. I think when I say this, actually furthering cementing this relationship to make it actually a partnership that is not just sort of top-down engagement with community members, that it's sort of like, oh, this hearing is coming up, we need to, you know, put everything to the side that might have been in our strategic plan currently and being able to redirect our attention to this, but it becomes a partnership of engagement, because I'm 100% honest, just the subcommittee is just as strong as the community members that participate in it. You know, we have subcommittee members that have a lot of experience and can bring a lot of their skills and lived experience to this table, but I think the conversations wouldn't be as fruitful or being able to push us in some aspects if it wasn't because, you know, community entities and nonprofits and activists are part of the conversation. That's just sort of my response to that. I don't know if any other task force members may have something to add too. Well, if nobody else has anything else to respond, or I see you, Jaime, thank you so much, Ren. I think we are about 1 minute or 2 minutes. Sorry, my computer clock, it's ahead, so I always have to kind of guess what time actually it is. We have a couple minutes. I don't know if there are any final words from our subcommittee members or task force members are present, or any community members. Feel free to unmute yourself or put items in the chat. But if not, we'll be closing out in a minute or so. Maybe hearing none at the moment. We definitely encourage you all, please, if you have any connections or anybody that you would like us to reach out in the future. An individual, an organization that comes up to your mind within the next few days or a week, please feel free to share with us or make an e-connection with us so we can bring them to the table and be able to bring their skills and lived experiences and expertise in different demographics to this subcommittee. But thank you so much. Really appreciate this crew. And I hope you have a wonderful evening. Natalie, anything that I might have missed before we fully close out?
No, wonderful, wonderful job chairing. Thanks so much for your leadership, Hilda.
Thank you, folks. We'll have a great evening and look forward to seeing you guys soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.